He once carried drowning soldiers through black water under enemy fire. Tonight, he was standing beneath flickering grocery store lights, trying to trade those same medals for a loaf of bread. What happened inside that little grocery store in rural Montana would restore something far greater than pride. It would remind an entire town that a man can survive a war, come home wearing medals, and still be lost if no one remembers to look for him. Snow drifted slowly across the empty parking lot of Grayson's Market, coating the cracked asphalt in thin ribbons of white that shimmered beneath the pale yellow glow of old security lights. The December air carried the sharp scent of gasoline, wet wool, and chimney smoke rolling down from nearby cabins tucked into the mountains beyond town. It was almost 9 at night, late enough for the store to grow quiet, late enough for most people to stop noticing anyone except themselves. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. A tired country song played through dusty ceiling speakers. The heater near the entrance rattled weakly every few seconds like it was struggling to survive another winter. Near register 3 stood Walter Hayes, 90 years old, white-haired, thin beneath an old navy peacoat that hung from his shoulders like borrowed weight. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to organize a few wrinkled dollar bills beside a stack of canned soup, bread, eggs, and a small bag of dry cat food with a faded yellow label. His posture, though slower now, still carried traces of military discipline. Back straight, chin level, quiet dignity pressed carefully against exhaustion. The cashier scanned the last item without looking up. "That'll be $74.16. Walter nodded once and reached into his coat pocket. Coins clinked softly against the counter. Quarters, nickels, pennies polished smooth by time. He counted twice, then a third time. The silence around the register slowly thickened. Behind him, a young mother shifted impatiently with her shopping cart. Someone near the freezer aisle sighed loudly. Walter swallowed hard and looked down at the money in his palm. $52. Not enough. Not close. "Sir?" the cashier asked again, this time sharper. Walter's jaw tightened. "I'm a little short tonight." The cashier finally looked up, barely 20 years old. Red apron. Tired eyes already hardened by too many long shifts and too little patience. "Do you have another card, sir?" Walter reached carefully into the inside pocket of his peacoat and pulled out a small metal box wrapped in an old handkerchief. The cloth was faded blue, navy blue once, now nearly gray from years of folding and unfolding. He rested the box gently on the counter like it contained something fragile enough to break the room apart. The cashier frowned. "What is that?" Walter hesitated before opening it. Inside, beneath the harsh fluorescent light, several military medals caught the glow like pieces of buried sunlight. Bronze, silver, purple ribbon worn soft at the edges. One of them still carried faint scratches across its surface. The room around him seemed to quiet without warning. Even the country song overhead faded into the background. Walter cleared his throat softly. Would these count for anything? The cashier stared at him, confused at first, then uncomfortable. "Sir, we can't take medals as payment." Walter nodded slowly as though he already knew the answer before asking. "I understand." His voice was calm, not begging, not ashamed, just tired in a way that reached deeper than age. "I only need enough for the groceries." Near the entrance, the automatic doors slid open with a gust of cold wind and blowing snow. Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer stepped inside beside a large German shepherd whose dark sable coat glistened with melting snowflakes beneath the overhead lights. Caleb looked like the kind of man people instinctively moved around without realizing it. Tall, broad-shouldered, white skin weathered slightly from years outdoors, strong jawline shadowed with stubble. Tattoos disappeared beneath the collar of his thermal jacket and curled down the back of his right hand where the outline of a German shepherd's face emerged through the ink. His amber-eyed K9, Rex, walked close beside him with calm discipline, paws silent against the tile floor. Caleb carried a small basket with dog food, black coffee, and a carton of eggs. He barely noticed the register at first, but Rex did. Halfway down the aisle, the shepherd slowed, ears rising, eyes fixed ahead. Caleb stopped instantly. Rex rarely stared at strangers, especially not like this. The dog's posture changed subtly, not aggressive, alert, focused in the strange way military dogs sometimes became when they sensed pain hidden beneath silence. Caleb followed the dog's gaze toward register 3. He saw the old man first, then the medals, then the look on the cashier's face. Rex moved before Caleb gave a command. Slow, controlled. The shepherd approached Walter quietly and sat beside him without making a sound. Walter looked down in surprise as the large dog rested calmly near his legs, amber eyes locked gently onto his face. For the first time all night, Walter's expression softened. Just a little. Well now, he whispered. Aren't you something? Rex's tail brushed once against the floor. Caleb stepped closer. The fluorescent lights reflected off the medals still resting inside the metal box. And then he saw it. A trident insignia worn nearly smooth with age. Navy SEALs. Caleb's expression changed instantly. His eyes moved to one ribbon in particular. Purple Heart. Another. Navy Cross. His chest tightened before he even realized why. Walter noticed him staring and quietly reached to close the box again. It's all right, the old man murmured. They don't seem to mean much these days. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then at the groceries. Then back at the medals. Outside, snow continued falling softly over the dark Montana town while inside Grayson's market, under tired fluorescent lights and the low hum of old refrigerators, something sacred and nearly forgotten was about to be seen again. Caleb didn't speak right away. He simply stood beside Rex while snow hissed softly against the glass doors behind them and the old heater near the entrance rattled like tired lungs. Walter lowered his eyes toward the medals again, his weathered fingers carefully touching the ribbons as though afraid they might disappear if left unattended too long. The cashier shifted. Awkwardly. Sir, if you can't pay, I'm going to need you to put some items back. Walter nodded once. No anger. No complaint. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who had spent a lifetime swallowing disappointment without making it someone else's burden. He reached first for the eggs. I can leave these. Then the bread. And the coffee. His voice remained steady, but Caleb noticed the slight tremor hiding underneath it. The kind men carried when pride was all they had left to lose. Rex remained seated beside Walter, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. The shepherd kept staring at the old man with an intensity that made the room feel strangely still. Caleb had seen that look before. Overseas. Hospitals. Airports. Funerals. Rex always knew when someone was carrying invisible weight. Keep the groceries, Caleb finally said. His voice was low and calm beneath the humming lights. Walter looked up. Son, you don't have to do that. Caleb stepped forward and placed his basket beside Walter's items. Yeah, the cashier added quickly, relieved. He can pay if he wants. Caleb ignored the cashier completely. His eyes stayed on the medals. Navy Cross, he said quietly. There aren't many men walking around with one of those. Walter gave a faint smile that barely touched his tired face. There aren't many of us left walking around at all. Something about the way he said it settled heavily into the air. The young mother behind them lowered her eyes. Even the impatient man near the freezer aisle stopped pretending not to listen. Caleb glanced again at the old trident insignia inside the box. The edges were worn smooth from decades of handling. SEAL Team 2. Walter blinked slowly, surprised. Long time ago. Vietnam. Walter nodded. Back when boys left home young and came back older than their fathers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere near aisle 6, a refrigerator compressor clicked on with a low mechanical groan. Outside, snow covered the parking lot deeper now, softening the world beyond the windows into pale white silence. Caleb rested one hand gently against Rex's neck. My father used to talk about Operation Black Tide. Walter's eyes lifted immediately. The movement was small, but Caleb saw it. Recognition. Pain. Memory. Not many people know that name, Walter whispered. Caleb swallowed once. My dad served Marine Recon in Da Nang. Said there was a Navy team that pulled 3 wounded Marines out of flooded jungle after a storm wiped out communications. Walter looked away. That was a long time ago. He said the team leader carried a wounded corporal nearly 2 miles through chest-deep water. Walter's jaw tightened faintly. Stories grow bigger with age. Caleb studied the old man carefully now. The exhaustion in his face. The slight limp in his left leg. The way his right hand drifted unconsciously toward his ribs every few seconds as if old injuries still lived there beneath the coat. Rex slowly rested his head against Walter's knee. The old man froze for a second before gently placing one trembling hand onto the shepherd's fur. His fingers sank into the thick sable coat carefully, almost reverently. "Beautiful dog," Walter murmured. Caleb gave a small nod. "Saved my life twice." Walter looked at Rex with understanding that only soldiers and old dogs seemed capable of sharing. "Then he outranks both of us." The cashier cleared his throat awkwardly, suddenly aware that half the store was listening. "Do you want me to finish the transaction, sir?" Caleb reached into his wallet and handed over a dark credit card. "Ring everything up. Everything. Everything." The cashier scanned the groceries quickly now, suddenly eager to move past the tension hanging around the register. Caleb noticed Walter trying to protest again, but the old man stopped when Rex leaned more heavily against his leg. It was almost as if the shepherd was telling him to stay still for once. Walter looked down at the dog and exhaled slowly through his nose. "You know," he said softly, "we had one overseas. Shepherd named Duke. Smarter than half our officers." Caleb smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." Walter's eyes drifted somewhere far away. "Dog slept beside me through monsoon season. Used to shake rainwater all over the radio equipment." For the first time since Caleb entered the store, a little warmth crept into the old man's voice. "Small, fragile, but real." The cashier handed over the receipt. Caleb took it without looking and began bagging the groceries himself. Walter watched quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I was not trying to sell them, you know." Caleb looked up. "The metals." Walter's fingers tightened slightly around the metal box. "I just thought maybe they might hold enough value for food." The words landed softly, but they hit harder than shouting ever could. Caleb felt anger rise briefly in his chest. Not toward Walter, toward the coldness of a world that could reduce a man's service to loose change beneath fluorescent lights. But he kept his expression calm. Men like Walter deserve dignity, not pity. "You should never have had to ask," Caleb said quietly. Walter looked down again. "Life can get pretty small when you get old." Rex suddenly lifted his head and gave a soft huff through his nose. Walter smiled faintly at that. "Except dogs," he whispered. "They never see you smaller." Caleb zipped the final grocery bag closed. "You got someone waiting at home for you." Walter hesitated before answering. "Just an old cat named Maggie." "Family." A long silence followed. Walter stared toward the snowy parking lot beyond the windows. Not anymore. The heater rattled again near the entrance. Somewhere outside, wind pushed loose snow against the glass with a dry, whispering sound. Caleb picked up the grocery bags while Rex stood beside Walter protectively, unwilling to move far from him. Then Caleb noticed something near the bottom of the metal box. Folded beneath the metals rested a faded photograph. Water damaged, bent at the corners. 3 young servicemen standing beside a helicopter with jungle behind them. One of them was Walter. Younger, strong, smiling beneath the impossible weight of another lifetime. And beside him stood a Marine wearing recon patches on his sleeves. Caleb's chest tightened the moment he recognized the face. Because he had seen that photograph once before. In his father's garage. Nearly 20 years ago. Caleb stared at the photograph while the noise of the grocery store slowly faded around him. The fluorescent lights. The humming refrigerators. The quiet shuffle of customers gathering their bags. For one strange moment, it all felt distant, like sound underwater. Because the Marine standing beside young Walter Hayes in that faded photograph was unmistakable. Same square jaw. Same deep-set eyes. Same crooked grin Caleb remembered from childhood pictures stored in dusty boxes back home. Thomas Mercer. His father. 27 years old in the photo. Lean. Sunburned. Wearing jungle fatigues with rolled sleeves and a tired smile that looked earned. Caleb's throat tightened unexpectedly. Walter noticed his expression. "You all right, son?" Caleb swallowed once before answering. "That man beside you." He pointed carefully toward the photograph. His name was Thomas Mercer. Walter blinked slowly. Then his tired eyes widened just slightly beneath the harsh grocery store lights. "Tommy." The old man's voice almost cracked around the name. "You're Tommy Mercer's boy?" Caleb nodded quietly. Walter stared at him in disbelief for several seconds. Then he looked down at Rex as though trying to steady himself through the dog's calm presence. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "I haven't heard that name spoken out loud in over 40 years. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the dark Montana highway beyond the parking lot. Inside the store, The heater rattled again, while Caleb carefully folded the photograph back into the metal box. Walter's hands trembled harder now, though not from cold. Memory had a way of shaking old men deeper than winter ever could. "My father died 8 years ago," Caleb said gently. Walter lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that. Heart failure." Walter nodded slowly. Tommy always pushed himself too hard. A faint smile appeared on the old man's weathered face. Marine recon boys thought they were invincible back then. Caleb let out the smallest breath of laughter. "That sounds like him." Walter leaned one hand against the counter as if the weight of years had suddenly grown heavier. "Your father saved my life once." Caleb looked at him carefully. Walter shook his head softly. "Truth is, we saved each other." The words settled quietly. Between them, honest, unadorned. The kind of truth older men no longer felt the need to decorate. Rex remained pressed close beside Walter, watching him with those steady amber eyes that always seemed to understand more than they should. The cashier awkwardly handed Caleb the final grocery bag. "Have a good night," he muttered, unable to meet Walter's eyes anymore. Walter gave the young man a polite nod anyway. No bitterness, no lecture, just grace where resentment would have been easier. Caleb picked up the bags. "You parked nearby?" Walter hesitated before answering. "Truck's out back. You shouldn't be driving in this weather alone." Walter gave a tired half-smile. "At 90 years old, son, most things start to feel alone eventually." Caleb didn't know why those words hit him so hard. Maybe because they sounded too close to something his own father might have said near the end. Or maybe because loneliness recognized itself when spoken plainly enough. As they walked slowly toward the exit, several customers quietly stepped aside for Walter without saying a word. The young mother near the register gently placed her hand over her little boy's shoulder and whispered something Caleb couldn't hear. The child looked up at Walter with wide eyes full of silent curiosity. Walter noticed and gave him a small nod. The boy nodded back seriously, like a tiny soldier returning respect he didn't fully understand yet. Cold wind swept through the automatic doors the moment they opened. Snowflakes drifted into the entryway and melted instantly against the tile floor. Caleb carried the groceries while Walter moved carefully beside Rex across the parking lot. The old man's boots crunched softly through fresh snow illuminated beneath pale parking lot lights. Near the far edge of the lot sat an old green pickup truck dusted heavily with snow. Rust lined the wheel wells. One headlight looked newer than the other. The truck itself seemed held together by stubbornness and memory. Walter stopped beside it and reached into his coat pocket for the keys, but his hand shook too badly to unlock the door at first. Caleb quietly took the keys and opened it for him without saying anything. The inside of the truck smelled faintly of cedar, old coffee, and worn leather. A small folded American flag rested carefully on the dashboard beside a faded photograph of a gray cat curled in someone's lap. Caleb placed the grocery bags gently onto the passenger seat. Rex jumped easily into the back cab after Walter gave him a soft nod of permission. Walter looked surprised. "He likes you," Caleb said. "He doesn't usually climb into strangers' trucks." Walter reached back and rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. Rex closed his eyes briefly beneath the touch. Maybe he remembers old soldiers too. Snow drifted sideways now beneath stronger wind rolling down from the mountains. Caleb glanced toward the highway. "Where are you headed?" Walter hesitated again. "About 20 miles north. Little trailer off County Road 12. Caleb frowned slightly. "That far? It's home." Caleb looked at the thin coat Walter wore. The old pickup, the exhaustion hiding behind his calm eyes. Then he looked at the temperature blinking red on the pharmacy sign across the road. 12 degrees. Dropping fast. "Do you have heat out there?" Walter looked away toward the dark road ahead. Silence answered first. Then finally, quietly, "Some nights." Caleb already knew what that meant. He leaned one arm against the truck door while snow collected slowly across his shoulders. "Mind if I follow you?" Walter immediately shook his head. "No need for that. I'm headed north anyway." It was a lie. Walter seemed to know it too, but the old man looked suddenly too tired to argue. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The wind howled softly through the parking lot lights while Rex watched both men carefully from inside the truck cab. Finally Walter exhaled through his nose and nodded once. Tommy would have done the same thing. Caleb gave a faint smile. Yeah, he probably would have. Walter climbed slowly into the driver's seat while Caleb closed the door gently behind him. Through the frosted window, the old Navy SEAL sat motionless for a moment with one hand resting on the steering wheel and the other on the small metal box of metals in his lap. Outside beneath the falling snow, Caleb suddenly realized something painful and simple at the same time. For nearly 90 years, Walter Hayes had carried the weight of serving his country. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, somebody else was finally helping him carry a little of it back. The two vehicles moved slowly through the Montana night beneath thick falling snow, their headlights cutting pale tunnels through the darkness, winding north along County Road 12. Walter's old pickup rattled slightly every time it crossed uneven patches of frozen pavement, while Caleb followed a careful distance behind in his black Ford Bronco, with Rex resting quietly in the back seat. The windshield wipers swept steadily back and forth, pushing aside snow that returned almost immediately like restless ghosts refusing to settle. Beyond the road, endless pine forests stood dark beneath the storm, their branches bending under fresh snow, while distant mountains disappeared behind gray winter clouds. Caleb kept thinking about the photograph. His father standing beside Walter almost 50 years ago, younger than Caleb himself was now, alive in a way that only old pictures preserve forever. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He remembered being 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the garage floor while his father cleaned fishing gear beside a portable heater humming against the winter cold. Tommy Mercer had rarely spoken about Vietnam, but sometimes, late at night, after enough silence settled around the house, little pieces slipped through. A flooded jungle, a missing extraction helicopter, a Navy SEAL named Walt who carried injured Marines through rising black water after everyone else thought they were dead. Caleb used to think those stories sounded too large to belong to real people. Tonight, he realized heroes aged too. Their backs bent, their hands shook, their trucks rusted beneath snowstorms while the world forgot their names one grocery bill at a time. Up ahead, Walter's pickup turned off the main road onto a narrow gravel lane buried beneath several inches of fresh snow. Caleb slowed carefully and followed. The road climbed slightly through thick pines before opening into a small clearing surrounded by dark woods. A weather-beaten trailer sat near the edge of the trees beneath a crooked porch light glowing weak yellow against the storm. One side of the roof sagged slightly under accumulated snow. Wind rattled loose metal siding softly against the cold night air. Walter parked beside a stack of chopped firewood covered by an old blue tarp. Caleb pulled in behind him and killed the engine. For a moment, neither man moved. Snow tapped softly against the Bronco while Rex lifted his head and stared out the frosted windows toward the trailer. Caleb finally stepped outside into knee-deep cold wind, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and distant chimney smoke. Walter was already standing beside his truck, one hand braced lightly against the door for balance. "You didn't have to follow me all the way out here," he called over the wind. Caleb grabbed the grocery bags from the back seat. "Yeah, I kind of did." Walter gave a tired little shake of his head, but said nothing more. Rex jumped down beside Caleb, his paws crunching through fresh snow while his breath curled white into the freezing night. The shepherd immediately moved toward Walter again, as though pulled there by instinct. The old man rested one gloved hand against Rex's neck while they walked slowly toward the trailer together. Up close, the place looked even rougher than Caleb expected. Paint peeled from the outer walls in long faded strips. One window had been patched with plastic sheeting taped carefully around the edges. Near the porch steps sat an old rocking chair dusted in snow beside a rusted coffee can full of cigarette but's gone soft from melted ice. But despite the wear, the place carried signs of care. The porch had been swept recently. A tiny wreath hung beside the front door. Someone had tried to keep dignity alive here. Walter unlocked the trailer and pushed the door open slowly. Warmth didn't greet them, only stillness. The inside smelled faintly of old books, cedar wood, canned soup, and the dry metallic scent of electric heaters running too hard for too long. A single lamp glowed beside a worn recliner draped with a folded navy blanket. The heater near the wall clicked. Weakly every few seconds, but produced little actual warmth. Caleb immediately noticed his own breath faintly visible in the room. Too cold inside. Much too cold. Walter shuffled carefully toward the thermostat mounted near the kitchen doorway. He tapped it twice with his finger before muttering softly, "The heat works whenever it feels patriotic." Caleb frowned. How long has it been running like this? Walter shrugged gently, long enough to stop being surprised by it. Rex moved quietly through the trailer, sniffing corners slowly before settling near a small, orange tabby cat curled asleep on a blanket beside the couch. The cat opened one sleepy eye, stared at the massive German shepherd for a second, then calmly returned to sleep. Walter smiled faintly at the sight. That's Maggie, meanest creature in Montana. Caleb set the grocery bags onto the kitchen counter and looked around more carefully now. The trailer was small but tidy. Military photographs lined the shelves beside old coffee tins and worn paperbacks. An American flag folded neatly inside a glass frame hung above the television. Near the recliner stood a walker Caleb suspected Walter only used when nobody was around to see it. Then Caleb noticed something else. On the kitchen table sat a stack of unopened envelopes held together by a rubber band. Final notices, utility warnings, past due stamps in angry red ink. Walter saw him looking and quietly reached over to turn the stack face down. Nothing worth reading tonight. Caleb said nothing. The silence itself carried enough understanding. Walter slowly removed his pea coat and hung it carefully beside the door. Underneath, he looked even thinner. His flannel shirt hung loose against narrow shoulders, shaped by age and too many hard winters. Rex approached him immediately and pressed gently against his leg. Walter looked down at the shepherd with tired affection. "You remind me of Duke," he whispered softly. "Always checking on everybody." Caleb stood near the kitchen counter while wind rattled lightly against the trailer walls outside. What happened to him? Walter's expression softened with memory. Lived to 14. Deaf as a fence post by the end. A small smile appeared. Still followed me room to room anyway. Caleb nodded quietly. Some loyalties survived long after strength disappeared. Walter opened one grocery bag and carefully removed the loaf of bread as though it were something precious. Then the eggs. Then a can of soup. Each item placed gently into old cabinets with slow, deliberate care. Caleb watched him silently until Walter finally stopped moving and leaned one hand against the counter. The old man's shoulders lowered slightly then, almost imperceptibly, like someone finally too tired to pretend everything was fine. "Truth is," Walter said quietly without turning around, "I was down to my last can of beans this morning." Outside, the storm deepened around the little trailer in the woods while inside, beneath weak yellow light and the quiet breathing of an old cat and a loyal dog, Caleb Mercer began to understand just how close forgotten heroes could come to disappearing. Walter stood quietly beside the kitchen counter while snow whispered against the trailer walls outside like restless fingers brushing old memories. The weak overhead light cast long shadows across the small room, touching faded photographs, worn furniture, and the lines carved deep into the old Navy veteran's face. Caleb looked toward the nearly empty pantry cabinets standing half open beside the stove. A few canned beans, salt crackers, instant coffee, not much else. The sight settled heavily into his chest. He had seen poor living conditions before during deployments overseas. Temporary shelters, damaged towns, forgotten places where people survived quietly because they no longer expected help. But something about seeing it here, in rural Montana beneath an American flag hanging over a 90-year-old veteran's kitchen table, hurt differently. Walter reached for one of the soup cans and turned it slowly in his hands. "Used to make stew every Sunday," he said softly. "My wife Eleanor insisted on it. Said no man should end the week hungry." Caleb leaned against the counter nearby while Rex settled near the old space heater beside Maggie the cat. The shepherd's amber eyes never drifted far from Walter for long. "How long has she been gone?" Caleb asked gently. Walter smiled faintly without looking up. 10 years come spring." His voice stayed calm, but grief still lived beneath it like old fire buried under ash. "Cancer took her slow. She hated hospitals more than dying." He set the soup can down carefully. "She made me promise I'd keep the trailer warm after she was gone." Walter glanced toward the rattling heater and gave a quiet breath through his nose. "I haven't exactly upheld my end of that bargain lately." Caleb looked toward the thermostat again. 52 degrees inside, maybe lower near the windows where cold air slipped through cracked seals around the frames. Walter noticed him looking. Electric company gives warnings before they shut things off. They're decent about it. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "How long since you had a proper furnace repair?" 2 winters maybe." "Walter, The old man raised one tired hand gently before Caleb could continue. Son, there are younger families out there hurting worse than me. I still wake up breathing every morning. That already puts me ahead of a lot of good men. Silence settled between them for several moments while wind moved softly through the pine trees outside. Then Walter slowly lowered himself into the recliner near the lamp, his joints stiff with age and cold. Rex immediately stood and walked over, resting beside the chair with his head across Walter's boots. The old veteran smiled down at him. There he is. Knew you would end up guarding somebody. Caleb watched quietly from the kitchen. He remembered his father saying something once after too many late-night whiskeys at the lake cabin years ago. Dogs always know where the hurt sits deepest. At the time, Caleb thought it was drunken rambling. Tonight it felt true enough to ache. Walter leaned down carefully and scratched behind Rex's ears. Duke used to sleep by the front door every night, he murmured, even after his hips gave out. His eyes drifted toward the dark window beyond the recliner. Storms scared him near the end. He would come sit beside Eleanor's chair whenever thunder rolled in. Caleb sat slowly at the kitchen table, the old wooden chair creaking. Beneath him, what happened after she passed? Walter was quiet for a long time before answering. The heater clicked weakly. Maggie stretched lazily beside Rex. Snow continued falling beyond the windows beneath the dim porch light outside. Finally, Walter spoke. Everything got smaller. Caleb listened without interrupting. First, the hospital bills. Then my son lost his construction job. Walter's eyes lowered toward his folded hands. Painkillers got hold of him after a back injury. Happens more than people like admitting. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. I tried helping him. God knows I tried. Caleb looked down at the table silently. Walter swallowed once before continuing. 3 years ago, they found him asleep in his truck during winter. The room grew still around the words. Engine was off. Snow had covered half the windshield by morning. Walter stared toward nothing for several seconds. After that, it was just me and Maggie. Rex slowly lifted his head and rested his muzzle more firmly against Walter's knee as though the shepherd understood every word. Walter smiled sadly and scratched the dog's neck. Funny thing is, I spent most of my life preparing for war. He looked around the trailer quietly. Turns out loneliness was the harder enemy. Caleb felt something tighten painfully in his chest, because he understood that sentence too well. After Afghanistan, there were nights Caleb sat awake in dark apartments listening to old heating vents rattle, while entire weekends passed without hearing another human voice. Service taught men how to survive danger. It rarely taught them how to survive silence afterward. Walter reached toward the small side table beside the recliner and picked up an old framed photograph. Caleb recognized Eleanor immediately from the younger picture on the dashboard earlier. She had kind eyes, soft silver hair tucked beneath a knitted winter hat. Walter held the frame gently in both hands. She used to volunteer at the church pantry every Thursday. A faint smile appeared. Half the town pretended to need groceries just so they could talk to her. Caleb smiled slightly. She sounds special. Walter nodded once. Best person I ever knew. The old man stared at the photograph quietly while snow drifted thicker beyond the windows now, covering the clearing outside in soft white stillness. Then Walter spoke again, almost to himself. She would hate knowing I tried trading metals for groceries tonight. Caleb looked up sharply, but Walter gave a small tired shake of his head before he could respond. Not because of pride. His fingers brushed lightly across the edge of the photograph frame. Because she believed those medals belonged to every man who didn't come home. The room fell silent again. Caleb glanced toward the metal box resting on the coffee table nearby. Bronze ribbons catching weak yellow light beside unpaid bills, and an old television remote held together with tape. Symbols of sacrifice sitting quietly beside ordinary hardship. Rex suddenly stood and walked toward the front door. His ears lifted, body alert. Caleb frowned slightly. What is it, boy? The shepherd gave a low huff and stared toward the frosted window near the porch. Walter slowly looked up from Eleanor's photograph. Outside, through falling snow and darkness, headlights had just appeared at the edge of the clearing. The headlights moved slowly through the snow beyond the clearing, pale beams cutting across the pine trees before turning toward the trailer. Rex remained near the front door, ears raised high now, body perfectly still except for the faint movement of his breathing. Caleb stood from the kitchen table automatically, every instinct sharpened from years of military habit. Walter, however, only sighed softly and placed Eleanor's photograph back onto the side table beside his chair. "Probably Sheriff Dugan," he murmured. "He checks on me after storms sometimes." Outside, tires crunched over packed snow as the vehicle came to a stop near the porch. A moment later, an old truck door opened, followed by the muffled sound of boots against frozen ground. Wind rattled the trailer windows softly while someone climbed the porch steps. Then came a knock. 3 slow taps against the door. Walter looked toward Caleb with faint amusement. You would think after 20 years the man would just walk in. Caleb opened the door before Walter could rise from the recliner. Cold air swept immediately into the trailer, carrying snowflakes and the sharp scent of pine. Standing beneath the porch light was a broad-shouldered older man bundled in a brown sheriff's jacket dusted white with snow. His beard was gray now, thick around a weathered face marked by years outdoors. He removed his hat slowly the moment he noticed Caleb and Rex standing inside. "Evening," he said quietly. Then his eyes shifted toward Walter. "Roads are getting ugly out here tonight." Walter smiled faintly from the recliner. "Still prettier than New Jersey." The sheriff snorted softly. "Everything is prettier than New Jersey." He stepped inside and stamped snow from his boots near the door. Rex watched him carefully for a second before relaxing again beside Walter's chair. "Good dog," the sheriff murmured. "Looks like he already adopted you." Caleb shut the door against the wind. Walter gestured toward him. "Sheriff Dugan, this is Caleb Mercer, son of Tommy Mercer." The sheriff's tired eyes widened slightly. "Tommy Mercer?" He looked back at Caleb carefully. "Recon Tommy?" Caleb nodded once. "That was my father." Sheriff Dugan shook his head slowly in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned." He removed his gloves and tucked them into his coat pocket while snow melted from his shoulders onto the trailer floor. "Your father saved my hide once near Key San." Caleb blinked in surprise. "You served with him too?" The sheriff gave a low laugh. "Half the old fools in this county served with somebody at one point or another." He glanced toward Walter. "Difference is, Walt here never talks about any of it." Walter looked down at Rex quietly. "Most memories are heavier spoken out loud." The sheriff's eyes drifted toward the grocery bags on the counter and the stack of overdue bills partly hidden beneath a newspaper near the sink. Something in his expression changed then. Sadness mixed with frustration already too familiar. "You lose power again?" Walter shrugged gently. "Not yet." Sheriff Dugan rubbed one hand over his beard and looked toward Caleb. "Town utility board keeps threatening shutoff notices. I've argued with them twice already." Walter lifted one hand immediately. "Do not start that again, Bill. Somebody has to." The sheriff's voice sharpened briefly before softening again. "You shouldn't be freezing out here at your age." Walter smiled faintly. "I survived monsoon season in Vietnam. Little Montana winter is not taking me down." Sheriff Dugan muttered something under his breath and moved toward the kitchen table. Then he stopped suddenly when he noticed the metal box of medals resting beside the folded grocery receipt. "Walt." His voice grew quieter now. "Tell me you didn't." Walter said nothing. That silence answered enough. The sheriff closed his eyes briefly. "God Almighty." Caleb looked between them while wind groaned softly outside through the trees. Sheriff Dugan pulled out a chair and sat heavily at the table. "That grocery manager called me after you left." Walter frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because some kid posted a video online." Caleb looked up immediately. "What kind of video?" The sheriff sighed deeply. "Some customer filmed the whole thing at the register. You opening the metal box. Trying to pay for food." Walter's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't ask anybody to film me." "I know." Sheriff Dugan rubbed tired eyes with one hand. "Kid probably thought he was documenting drama for social media." Caleb felt anger stir quietly in his chest. Walter, however, only leaned back slowly into the recliner beside Rex. "People record everything now." His voice carried no bitterness, just resignation. Sheriff Dugan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. "Problem is, the video is spreading fast." Walter looked genuinely confused. Why would anybody care about an old man buying groceries? Caleb exchanged a glance with the sheriff. Because the world still recognized dignity when it saw it broken in public, even if only for a moment. Sheriff Dugan turned the screen toward them. Thousands of comments already flooded beneath the clip. Some angry, some grieving, some simply stunned. One comment near the top read, "That man fought for this country, and now he can't afford heat?" Another said, "Find him. Somebody help this veteran." Walter stared quietly at the glowing screen without speaking. The light reflected faintly in his tired blue eyes. I don't want charity, he said at last. Caleb stepped closer. This is not charity. Walter looked up at him. Caleb's voice stayed calm. People are reacting because they know something is wrong about this. The old Navy veteran lowered his eyes again toward Rex resting beside his chair. The shepherd had fallen half asleep now, one paw stretched protectively across Walter's boot like he had already decided the old man belonged to his pack. Sheriff Dugan leaned forward at the table. Walt, there are veterans groups already asking about you. Somebody recognized the ribbons. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. I spent 50 years trying not to be noticed. Maybe that's the problem, the sheriff replied softly. Silence filled the trailer once more while snowstorm winds brushed against the walls outside. Then suddenly a notification sound echoed from the sheriff's phone again. Another message. Then another. Sheriff Dugan frowned down at the screen. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb looked over. What? The sheriff slowly turned the phone toward them again. A newly uploaded photograph had appeared online less than 2 minutes earlier. An old military picture from Vietnam. 3 young servicemen standing beside a helicopter. Walter Hayes, Tommy Mercer, and Sheriff Bill Dugan himself. Underneath the photo, someone had written only 6 words. They saved lives. Now save theirs. The trailer grew quieter after that. Even the storm outside seemed to soften beneath the weight of what had just appeared on Sheriff Dugan's phone screen. Walter stared at the old photograph for several long seconds without speaking. 3 young men frozen forever in another lifetime. Uniforms damp from jungle rain. Faces thinner. Eyes sharper. Alive with the stubborn certainty of youth before grief and time had carved themselves into their bones. Caleb watched Walter carefully from across the room. The old Navy veteran's expression had changed somehow. Not quite sadness. Not quite peace either. More like someone unexpectedly hearing a familiar song after believing the world had forgotten its melody. Sheriff Dugan set the phone slowly onto the kitchen table. Notifications continued lighting up the screen every few seconds. More comments. More shares. More strangers suddenly paying attention to a man who had spent decades quietly disappearing. Walter leaned back deeper into the recliner while Rex rested beside him, the shepherd's head still pressed against his leg like an anchor, keeping him steady. Who posted the photograph? Walter asked softly. Sheriff Dugan squinted at the screen. Looks like one of the guys from the grocery store recognized you. He scrolled again. Says his grandfather served in Da Nang. Walter gave a faint nod. Small world. Not small enough, the sheriff muttered. Caleb moved toward the small kitchen window and looked outside. Snow still drifted through the clearing beneath pale moonlight, barely visible behind heavy clouds. The porch light glowed weakly against the dark trees surrounding the trailer. Quiet, cold, isolated. Yet somehow the world had suddenly found this place tonight. He could feel it happening already. The strange, invisible current of attention moving outward through phones and screens and sleepless people sitting in warm homes, scrolling past one painful truth they couldn't ignore. Caleb turned back toward Walter. You all right? Walter smiled faintly without lifting his eyes. At my age, son, surviving surprises counts as a successful evening. Maggie the cat stretched lazily beside the heater and climbed slowly into Walter's lap. The old man stroked her orange fur absent-mindedly, while Sheriff Dugan continued reading comments under the growing video online. People are angry, the sheriff said quietly. Walter sighed softly. That never fixes much. Maybe not. But sometimes it reminds folks they still have a conscience. Another notification appeared. Then another. The sheriff suddenly frowned. You've got to be kidding me. Caleb looked over. What now? Sheriff Dugan turned the phone around slowly. A veterans organization based in Billings had reposted the video along with Walter's military records. Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Silver Star. Several commendations still partially classified. Beneath the post were thousands of reactions pouring in by the minute. One comment simply read, "We leave too many heroes behind after the war's end." Walter looked genuinely uncomfortable now. I don't need all this fuss. Caleb walked over and sat quietly at the kitchen table across from him. Maybe this is not about fuss. Walter raised tired eyes toward him. Caleb spoke carefully. Maybe people just needed reminding what sacrifice actually looks like. The old veteran looked down at Maggie sleeping against his chest. Sacrifice is ordinary, son. Every generation does it. Not everybody. Walter gave a small smile. No, but enough. Silence settled gently across the trailer again. The heater rattled weakly. Snow whispered against the windows. Rex shifted slightly beside the recliner, one amber eye half open as if unwilling to fully relax, while Walter remained awake. Then suddenly headlights appeared again outside the clearing. Another vehicle. Caleb instinctively looked toward the window. Sheriff Dugan frowned. Who in God's name would be driving out here this late? Tires crunched slowly across fresh snow before stopping near the porch beside the sheriff's truck. A moment later, another set of footsteps climbed the wooden steps outside. Rex lifted his head immediately, but didn't bark. Just watched. Then came another knock against the trailer door. Sheriff Dugan stood first this time and opened it carefully. Cold wind rushed inside, carrying swirling snowflakes around the doorway. Standing beneath the porch light was a tall, older man wrapped in a heavy military coat with snow gathered thick across his shoulders. He looked somewhere in his 70s now. Broad frame slightly bent by age. White beard trimmed close along a stern, weathered face. His eyes searched the room only briefly before landing on Walter. And the moment they did, something inside him broke loose. Walter froze in the recliner. Maggie immediately jumped down from his lap. The old Navy veteran stared toward the doorway in complete disbelief. Frank. The man stepped slowly inside, boots heavy against the floor. His eyes already glistened beneath the yellow porch light. Lord above, he whispered. It really is you. Caleb looked between them while Sheriff Dugan quietly shut the door behind the stranger. Walter slowly pushed himself upright from the recliner, one trembling hand gripping the armrest for balance. Rex stood instantly beside him as though ready to hold him upright if needed. The older man removed his gloves carefully. His hands shook too now. Frank Delaney. Sheriff Dugan explained softly toward Caleb. Former SEAL. Frank never looked away from Walter. I saw the video 30 minutes ago. His voice cracked slightly around the words. Drove straight through the storm from Helena. Walter stared at him like someone seeing a ghost rise out of memory itself. You old bastard, he whispered. Frank laughed once through wet eyes before pulling Walter into a rough embrace neither man seemed physically prepared for, but emotionally needed more than breath. For several seconds the little trailer held only the sound of winter wind outside and two old soldiers trying not to cry in front of younger men. Caleb quietly looked away toward the kitchen while Sheriff Dugan rubbed one hand across his beard. Rex sat calmly beside them, watching with silent understanding older than language. Frank finally stepped back and gripped Walter's shoulders tightly. You disappear for 15 years, and this is how I find you. Walter managed a tired smile. I was aiming for a quieter reunion. Frank shook his head fiercely. No, absolutely not. He glanced around the freezing trailer, the failing heater, the patched windows, the overdue bills half hidden beneath newspapers. Pain crossed his face slowly as realization settled in. Walt, he whispered softly, why did you not call somebody? Walter looked toward the floor for a long moment before answering. After enough funerals and enough years, you stop wanting to feel like a burden. The room fell silent again, and in that silence Caleb realized something heartbreaking. Walter Hayes had not been abandoned by America all at once. He had simply faded little by little into the cracks between people assuming somebody else would remember him. Frank Delaney stayed beside Walter long after the embrace ended, one rough hand still gripping the old veteran's shoulder like he was afraid the man might disappear again if he let go too quickly. Snow rattled softly against the trailer windows while the weak heater clicked uselessly in the corner beside Rex and Maggie. The little home suddenly felt smaller now, crowded not by bodies, but by memories too large for the room to hold. Caleb stood quietly near the kitchen counter watching the two old soldiers study each other beneath the dim yellow light. Time had changed them both. Bent their backs, silvered their hair, slowed their hands, but there was still something unmistakably sharp inside their eyes. Men who had carried each other through darkness once never fully stopped recognizing one another. Frank finally shook his head slowly and let out a breath that almost sounded angry. You should have called me, Walt. Walter lowered himself carefully back into the recliner while Rex settled immediately at his feet again. And say what exactly? Frank stared at him. Walter gave a tired little shrug. Hey Frank, I can't afford heating oil and my cat eats better than I do. Damn right. Frank snapped before softening instantly. That's exactly what you should have said. Silence settled heavily between them. Sheriff Dugan leaned back against the kitchen sink with folded arms while Caleb quietly poured fresh coffee into mismatched mugs sitting near the stove. The trailer smelled faintly now of reheated soup, cedar wood, wet wool, and old paper. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the clearing in white silence. Frank finally removed his heavy military coat and draped it across a chair. Beneath it, he still carried the broad chest and disciplined posture of a career operator despite the years. A faded seal, trident tattoo disappeared beneath the sleeve of his thermal shirt. "You know what made me sick?" he said quietly. "Seeing that video online." Walter looked down toward Maggie sleeping against his lap. "People love feeling sorry for old men." "No." Frank's voice sharpened again. "Seeing you standing there trying to hand over medals for groceries." He rubbed one weathered hand across his beard slowly. "Those medals belong in a museum somewhere." Walter smiled faintly. "Museums are just storage units with better lighting." Caleb handed Frank a mug of coffee before taking one himself. Sheriff Dugan accepted the fourth cup with a grateful nod. Steam curled softly through the trailer while the four men stood together beneath the weak kitchen light, like survivors of some long-forgotten shipwreck. Frank sat heavily at the table and looked toward Caleb. "You really Tommy Mercer's son?" Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir." Frank shook his head in amazement. "Your father once stole an entire case of peaches from a Navy supply crate because Walt complained about eating powdered eggs for 3 weeks straight." Walter let out a low laugh for the first time all night. Real laughter, rusted with age but still alive somewhere underneath everything else. Tommy nearly got court-martialed over that. Sheriff Dugan smirked into his coffee. "Worth it, though. Those peaches were incredible." The room softened slightly after that. Stories drifted slowly across the trailer like smoke rising from old campfires. Tiny memories untouched for decades finally finding air again. Frank talked about monsoon rains so heavy they drowned radio signals. Sheriff Dugan remembered Tommy Mercer singing terrible country songs during overnight patrols just to keep exhausted Marines awake. Walter mostly listened, smiling quietly now and then while Rex slept against his boots as though the shepherd understood these stories mattered. Caleb watched them carefully while snow continued piling against the windows outside. He realized something strange then. Tonight was not only saving Walter. In some way, it was resurrecting pieces of all of them. Men who had spent years carrying grief separately were suddenly remembering they had once belonged to something together. Sheriff Dugan's phone buzzed again on the counter. Then again. Frank glanced toward it. "Still blowing up?" The sheriff nodded. Local news station picked up the story. Walter groaned softly from the recliner. "Wonderful. Exactly what every 90-year-old man wants." Caleb smiled faintly. "You're becoming famous." Walter looked horrified by the idea. "I survived classified missions overseas only to get ambushed by the internet." Even Frank laughed at that. But then Sheriff Dugan's expression slowly turned serious as he scrolled through the latest messages. "Walt," he said quietly, "there are unofficial donation pages already popping up." Walter's smile disappeared instantly. "No, you've not even looked yet." "No," Walter repeated more firmly. "I don't want strangers sending money because they feel guilty for 5 minutes online." Caleb understood the resistance immediately. Pride was not the right word for it. Men like Walter didn't measure worth through comfort. They measured it through usefulness, through earning every meal, every dollar, every breath. Accepting help without service in return felt unnatural to them. Frank leaned forward at the table. "This is not pity." Walter looked away toward the dark window. "Feels close enough." Silence returned again. The heater clicked weakly. Wind moved through the trees outside with a low, hollow moan. Then Rex slowly lifted his head and stood. The shepherd walked quietly across the trailer toward the front door, where Walter's old peacoat still hung from the hook beside the entrance. He sniffed near one pocket briefly before nudging the coat gently with his nose. Caleb frowned slightly. "What is it?" Rex pawed softly at the coat again. Walter looked confused. "Probably smells grocery store food." But Caleb already knew the dog well enough to notice the difference. Rex was searching for something specific. The shepherd nudged the coat once more until a small folded envelope slipped from the inside pocket and fluttered onto the floorboards near the door. Walter stared at it silently. Sheriff Dugan bent down and picked it up first. His expression changed the moment he saw the return address printed across the front. Montana Veterans Assistance Office. Walter exhaled quietly. I forgot that was there. Sheriff Dugan carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. His eyes scanned the page once before lifting slowly toward Walter. Walt, he said softly, they denied your emergency heating assistance request? Walter looked down toward his hands. Third time. Frank stared at him in disbelief. Caleb felt anger rise deep in his chest again, colder this time. Not loud anger. Worse. The kind that settled into silence because words suddenly felt too small. Sheriff Dugan continued reading quietly. Insufficient documentation. Delayed processing. Pending review. He lowered the paper slowly. Jesus Christ. Walter gave a faint shrug like a man already too tired to argue with disappointment anymore. Government paperwork always moves slower than winter. Rex returned quietly to Walter's side and rested his head against the old veteran's knee again. Walter placed one trembling hand onto the shepherd's neck and closed his eyes for a moment. Outside, snow buried the trailer deeper beneath the Montana night, while inside, 4 men sat beneath weak yellow light realizing something painful at the same time. Walter Hayes had not nearly frozen because nobody cared. He had nearly frozen because caring had become trapped behind systems too slow to reach him before loneliness did. The trailer stayed quiet after Sheriff Dugan finished reading the denial letter. Nobody seemed to know what to say anymore. The heater clicked weakly beside the wall, trying and failing to push warmth through the cold little room, while snow buried the clearing deeper outside. Walter sat motionless in the recliner with one hand resting gently against Rex's thick sable fur. The old Navy veteran looked smaller somehow now beneath the dim yellow light. Not weak, just worn down by too many years of carrying hardship alone. Caleb watched him carefully from the kitchen table. He had seen wounded men overseas hide pain better than civilians ever could. Walter carried himself the same way. Calm voice, steady eyes, quiet hands. But underneath all of it sat exhaustion, so deep it almost felt permanent. Frank leaned back slowly in his chair and stared toward the denial letter lying open on the table. 3 requests, he muttered softly. 3 damn requests. Sheriff Dugan rubbed one hand across his tired face. County office keeps claiming funding shortages. Walter gave a faint shrug from the recliner. There are always shortages somewhere. Caleb looked toward him. You shouldn't have been wading through this alone. Walter smiled sadly. Most old men are alone eventually, son. The words lingered heavily in the trailer. Frank suddenly stood and walked toward the small kitchen window overlooking the storm outside. You know what bothers me most? He asked quietly. Nobody answered. Frank looked out toward the dark pine trees swaying beneath snow-covered branches. We spent years learning how to find stranded men in impossible places. He glanced back toward Walter. And somehow we missed one living 20 miles outside town. Walter opened his mouth to dismiss the guilt, but Frank lifted one hand first. No, let me say it. His voice softened. I thought about you over the years. Every Christmas, every reunion. I just assumed you were all right somewhere. Walter lowered his eyes toward Maggie sleeping beside him. Most people assumed that about old soldiers. Sheriff Dugan's phone buzzed again across the kitchen table. Then Caleb's phone buzzed too. Then Frank's. Notifications flooding in faster now. Caleb finally picked his up and frowned at the screen. There are reporters trying to figure out your address. Walter looked horrified. Absolutely not. Nobody is posting it, Caleb reassured him quickly. Sheriff already blocked one local station online. Sheriff Dugan grunted. I did more than block them. Threatened trespassing charges too. Frank sat back down heavily at the table and folded his hands together. People are not letting this go, Walt. Walter sighed quietly. The internet gets bored fast. Not this time. Caleb looked at the growing messages appearing across his screen. Veterans groups, active duty Marines, families of servicemen, even strangers offering hotel rooms and heating fuel. Thousands of people reacting to one painful image beneath grocery store lights. A 90-year-old veteran holding medals in trembling hands beside canned soup and bread. Caleb looked toward Walter again. People are angry because they see dignity in you. Walter shook his head faintly. People see a story. Caleb stood slowly from the table and walked toward the recliner. Maybe, but stories matter because they remind people who they're supposed to be. Walter studied him quietly for several seconds. Then a tiny smile touched the corner of his mouth. Your father talked like that sometimes. Caleb felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Did he? Walter nodded slowly. Especially after losing people. The room softened into silence again. Then suddenly another sound rose beneath the storm outside. Engines. Multiple this time. Sheriff Dugan frowned immediately and stood. You've got to be kidding me. Headlights began appearing through the snowy, clearing one after another beyond the frosted windows. Trucks. SUVs. Slow-moving beams cutting through darkness beneath falling snow. Caleb stepped toward the window beside Frank, while Rex immediately stood alert near Walter's chair. Who are those people? Caleb asked. Sheriff Dugan squinted through the glass. Then his expression changed completely. Veterans. Outside, doors opened one after another beneath the storm. Men climbed out wearing old military jackets, heavy coats, knit caps, boots crunching through snow. Some moved stiffly with age, others younger. A few carried bags and toolboxes. One man hauled what looked like a portable heater from the back of a pickup truck. Another carried bundles of firewood beneath one arm. Walter stared toward the window in complete disbelief. What in the world? Frank laughed softly through wet eyes. Looks like somebody remembered you after all. A knock sounded against the trailer door before Sheriff Dugan even reached it. The moment he opened it, cold wind rushed inside, carrying swirling snow and voices layered with concern. Walt, all right. We drove from Billings. Somebody said his heat was failing. Tell him we brought fuel. More figures moved through the snow behind them, carrying supplies through the storm like some strange midnight convoy guided by grief and loyalty instead of orders. Walter slowly pushed himself upright from the recliner, one trembling hand gripping the armrest while Rex stayed pressed firmly against his leg. The old veteran looked stunned. Not emotional yet. Just overwhelmed in the quiet way old soldiers became when kindness arrived too suddenly. The first man through the doorway removed his snow-covered hat. Immediately, he looked nearly 80 now with thick glasses fogged from the warm trailer air. Walter Hayes, he asked softly. Walter nodded once. The man's eyes filled instantly. You saved my older brother outside Hughes City in '68. Walter blinked in surprise. Your brother was Danny Collins? Yes, sir. The man swallowed hard. He talked about you until the day he died. Walter's expression cracked slightly then. Tiny, barely visible. But Caleb saw it. The moment the old veteran realized these people had not arrived because of medals or headlines or internet outrage. They came because somewhere across decades of war and grief, Walter Hayes had once mattered deeply to them or someone they loved. More people slowly filled the trailer carrying supplies inside, while snow blew around their boots near the doorway. Somebody replaced the failing heater with a newer portable unit humming warmly within minutes. Another veteran quietly stacked firewood beneath the porch awning outside. Nobody treated Walter like a charity case. Nobody used pity in their voices. They simply moved with the calm efficiency of people helping one of their own. Rex walked slowly through the crowded room, accepting brief pats from weathered hands before returning faithfully to Walter's side each time. The old Navy veteran stood near the recliner, surrounded by strangers who somehow didn't feel like strangers at all anymore. Then a younger Marine no older than 25 stepped carefully through the doorway, carrying 2 grocery bags. He paused when he saw Walter and straightened instinctively. Sir, he said quietly, my grandfather served in Da Nang. He passed away last year. Walter nodded gently. The young Marine swallowed hard before continuing. I just wanted to say thank you for bringing some of them home. Silence filled the trailer once more. And for the first time all night, Walter Hayes finally lowered his head and wiped quickly at his eyes while Rex leaned against him as though the shepherd already understood something sacred was happening inside that little snow-covered trailer in the woods. The trailer no longer felt cold after that. Not because the new portable heater hummed warmly beside the wall, though it did. Not because fresh coffee steamed from mismatched mugs spread across every surface in the tiny kitchen, though it smelled rich and comforting beneath the scent of pine and snow. The warmth came from something else entirely. Voices, laughter, boots tracking melted snow onto old linoleum floors. Men who had spent years carrying silence, suddenly remembering how to stand shoulder to shoulder again. Walter sat quietly near the recliner while people moved carefully through his home, like relatives returning after a long absence. Nobody treated the place with pity. They treated it with respect. One older veteran repaired loose weather stripping around the kitchen window using tools from his truck. Another carefully checked the failing furnace while muttering about outdated wiring beneath his breath. A younger Marine stacked canned food neatly inside the pantry cabinets without announcing it to anyone. Every act carried the same unspoken message. You're not alone anymore. Caleb stood near the doorway watching the scene unfold while Rex moved calmly among the visitors, accepting quiet pats and soft praise before always circling back toward Walter. The shepherd seemed unusually peaceful tonight, like some deep instinct inside him recognized healing when it entered a room. Sheriff Dugan sat at the kitchen table speaking quietly with Frank, while several phones continued buzzing endlessly with calls and messages. Walter looked overwhelmed every time another person knocked on the trailer door, carrying supplies or blankets, or fuel vouchers, or handwritten letters from strangers. This is getting out of hand, he murmured softly at one point. Frank glanced over while tightening his old military coat around broad shoulders still dusted with melted snow. No, he said quietly. This is what should have happened years ago. Walter lowered his eyes toward the cup warming his hands. I don't know what to do with all this attention. Caleb sat beside him slowly. You don't have to do anything. Walter gave a tired half-smile. That has never been my strong suit. The room around them glowed softly beneath warm yellow light now. Outside, the storm had eased slightly. Snow still drifted through the trees, but the wind no longer rattled the trailer walls so harshly. Somewhere near midnight, a volunteer electrician arrived carrying replacement space heaters and thick extension cords. Behind him came two women from the local church pantry with homemade stew and fresh bread wrapped carefully in towels to keep warm. Walter looked genuinely startled when one of them kissed his forehead gently before placing containers into his refrigerator. My father served in Korea, she whispered softly. Thank you for bringing somebody else's boy home. Walter couldn't answer right away after that. He simply nodded while blinking quickly beneath tired eyes. Caleb watched the old veteran carefully. Hours earlier, Walter Hayes had been standing alone beneath fluorescent grocery store lights, trying to exchange metals for food. Now his tiny trailer overflowed with strangers carrying kindness through a snowstorm, because somewhere deep down people still understood what sacrifice looked like when they saw it. Sheriff Dugan suddenly stood from the kitchen table with his phone pressed against one ear. You're serious? He asked into the receiver. The room quieted slightly around him. The sheriff listened for several seconds before slowly lowering the phone. Well, he muttered softly. That happened fast. Frank looked up. What now? Sheriff Dugan stared directly at Walter. Governor's office just called. Walter nearly choked on his coffee. Why in God's name would the governor care about me? Because apparently the entire state saw that grocery store video tonight. Walter groaned quietly into one weathered hand while several people around the room smiled faintly. Sheriff Dugan continued. State Veterans Affairs Office is sending an emergency response team tomorrow morning. Walter shook his head immediately. No cameras. Already told them. The sheriff pointed firmly toward him. And no reporters unless you approve it. Walter nodded gratefully. Frank leaned back against the kitchen counter with folded arms. About time somebody in government moved faster than a glacier. Caleb noticed Walter growing quieter as the night deepened. Not unhappy. Just emotionally exhausted in the way people became when years of loneliness suddenly cracked open all at once. Rex noticed it too. The shepherd climbed carefully beside the recliner and rested his large head across Walter's lap without invitation. Walter immediately relaxed one trembling hand into the dog's thick fur. You always know, don't you? He whispered softly. Rex's tail brushed once against the blanket draped across the recliner. Nearby, Maggie the cat slept soundly near the new heater while veterans quietly shared old stories around the kitchen table. The trailer sounded alive now. Caleb found himself staring toward the wall above the television where Walter's folded American flag rested inside the glass case beside Eleanor's photograph. The old Navy veteran had spent years preserving little pieces of dignity in silence while the world moved on around him too quickly to notice. And yet tonight, somehow, dignity had returned carrying coffee thermoses and toolboxes through falling snow. Around 1 a.m, several volunteers finally prepared to leave before the roads worsened again. Heavy coats were pulled back on, boots laced, hands shaken firmly beneath the warm trailer lights. One by one, they paused beside Walter before heading back into the storm. Some saluted him quietly. Others simply squeezed his shoulder. None of them said goodbye like strangers. Frank remained near the door watching the departures with folded arms and wet eyes he tried unsuccessfully to hide. "You realize this place is going to turn into a veterans' campground by sunrise," he muttered. Walter smiled faintly. Eleanor would have loved that. Caleb helped carry empty coffee cups toward the sink, while Sheriff Dugan stepped outside briefly to clear snow from the porch steps. Rex followed Walter slowly toward the front window overlooking the dark clearing now lined with tire tracks beneath moonlit snow. The old veteran stood there silently for several moments while headlights disappeared one by one down County Road 12. "You know what scares me most?" Walter asked quietly without turning around. Caleb approached beside him. "What?" Walter's tired eyes stayed fixed on the snowy darkness outside. "Getting used to this." Caleb frowned slightly. Walter swallowed once before continuing. "Hope can be dangerous when you spend too long without it." The words settled softly into the room. Honest. Fragile. Real. Caleb looked toward the old veteran standing there beneath weak yellow light, with a German shepherd pressed faithfully against his side, and suddenly understood something his father had tried teaching him years ago. Men survived war through strength, but they survived afterward through connection. Through someone remembering their name before loneliness convinced them they had become invisible. Rex slowly leaned harder against Walter's leg while snow drifted gently through the silent Montana woods beyond the glass. And for the first time in many years, Walter Hayes no longer looked like a forgotten man staring out into the dark alone. Morning arrived slowly over the Montana mountains, pale winter sunlight filtering through heavy clouds and fresh snow that blanketed the clearing around Walter's trailer in untouched white silence. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the pine trees shimmering beneath frost like rows of old sentries standing watch over the woods. Inside the trailer, warmth finally lingered in the air. The new heater hummed steadily near the wall, while the smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted softly from the kitchen. Caleb stood at the stove wearing a dark thermal shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, quietly cooking breakfast while Rex lay stretched near the front door beside Maggie the cat. Walter sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a navy blanket someone had brought during the night. Morning light touched the lines in his weathered face gently now, softening years of exhaustion into something calmer. Not healed, but no longer abandoned. Frank leaned against the counter sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, while Sheriff Dugan stood near the window staring toward the clearing outside. "You're going to want to see this," the sheriff muttered quietly. Caleb glanced up from the stove. "What?" Sheriff Dugan stepped aside from the window. Caleb walked over first and froze. Slightly at the sight outside. Vehicles lined County Road 12 nearly as far as the eye could see through the trees. Pickup trucks, SUVs, vans with Veterans Organization decals on the doors. Men and women bundled in heavy winter coats moved carefully through the snow carrying supplies toward the trailer. Some hauled lumber. Others carried boxes of groceries, propane tanks, blankets, tools, and heating equipment. One group near the edge of the clearing had already begun repairing the sagging porch roof before the morning sun fully rose. Walter slowly turned in his chair when he noticed the silence in the room. Caleb stepped aside so he could see out the window. The old veteran stared in complete disbelief. "Good Lord," he whispered softly. Outside, someone had planted a small American flag beside the porch steps during the night. Its fabric moved gently in the cold mountain breeze beneath the pale winter sky. Walter looked down at his coffee cup for a long moment before quietly shaking his head. "This can't all be because of one grocery store video." Frank smiled faintly. "No." He looked toward the old Navy veteran carefully. "This is because people have been waiting for a reason to remember what honor looks like." Rex rose slowly and walked toward Walter again, pressing his head against the old man's shoulder while movement continued outside the trailer windows. Caleb noticed Walter's eyes growing damp, but the old veteran quickly looked away toward the stove instead. "Your bacon is burning," he muttered quietly. Caleb smiled and returned to the kitchen. By 8 in the morning, the little clearing outside no longer looked forgotten. Veterans worked side by side beneath drifting snowmelt and pale sunlight, repairing broken steps, sealing drafty windows, reinforcing weak sections of the roof. Somebody replaced the failing porch light entirely. Another group stacked enough firewood beneath the awning to last through the rest of winter. Nobody argued. Nobody demanded recognition. They simply worked with the calm efficiency of people who understood service without needing applause attached to it. Walter eventually stepped outside wearing his old pea coat and a wool cap Frank insisted he borrow. The moment he appeared on the porch, conversations quieted naturally across the clearing. Men looked up from toolboxes and ladders. Younger Marines straightened instinctively. A few older veterans removed their hats. Walter stood there speechless beneath the cold morning air, while Rex remained beside him like a silent guardian. Sheriff Dugan walked carefully up the porch steps, carrying another armload of donated supplies. "Morning, celebrity." Walter groaned softly. "Do not start." The sheriff smiled faintly. "Too late for that." Caleb joined them outside, holding fresh coffee in paper cups someone from town had delivered at sunrise. Steam curled upward into the freezing air, while sunlight reflected off untouched snow around the clearing, almost bright enough to hurt the eyes. Walter watched strangers repairing his trailer for several long seconds before speaking quietly. "I spent years thinking people stopped caring." Caleb handed him a warm cup. "Maybe people just forgot where to look." Nearby, Frank stood with several older veterans examining the trailer's damaged furnace system. Their voices carried low through the cold air, while tools clinked softly against metal. Further down the road, more vehicles still arrived slowly through the snow. One old man climbed carefully from a rust-colored pickup carrying a folded military flag beneath one arm. Another younger woman delivered handwritten letters collected overnight from military families across the state. Walter looked overwhelmed each time someone approached him with gratitude he clearly didn't believe he deserved. Around mid-morning, a dark state vehicle finally arrived at the clearing carrying 2 representatives from Montana Veterans Affairs. Unlike reporters, they came quietly. No cameras, no speeches, just paperwork, concern, and visible discomfort after realizing how badly the system had failed a 90-year-old decorated veteran living 20 miles outside town. Walter sat with them briefly at the kitchen table, while Caleb remained outside, helping repair loose siding beside the porch. Through the trailer window, he could see the old veteran speaking calmly, while one state official wiped at his eyes more than once during the conversation. Rex stayed beside Walter the entire time. When the meeting finally ended nearly an hour later, one of the officials stepped outside and approached Caleb quietly. "We're expediting everything immediately," she said softly. "Housing repairs, medical support, heating assistance, full veteran benefits review." Caleb nodded once. "Good." The woman glanced back toward Walter through the trailer window. "I don't think he realizes how many people are talking about him today." Caleb looked toward the old Navy veteran sitting quietly at the table with Rex beside his chair and Maggie sleeping against the heater nearby. "I think he spent too many years believing he had already faded away." By afternoon, the trailer looked different. Stronger somehow. Warmer. The broken porch railing had been repaired. New insulation lined several windows. Fresh groceries filled the pantry cabinets completely. Somebody even replaced the old mailbox near the road with a new one painted dark navy blue. Walter noticed it while standing beside Caleb near the porch steps. "That was unnecessary," he murmured quietly. Caleb smiled faintly. "Looks better, though." Walter stared toward the new mailbox for several moments before speaking again. Eleanor always hated the old one. Snow slipped softly from pine branches overhead, while Rex rested nearby beneath weak winter sunlight. Then Walter looked toward Caleb with tired blue eyes carrying something close to peace for the first time since the grocery store. "Your father used to say something during storms," he said softly. Caleb looked up. Walter smiled faintly. "No man gets through darkness alone. Not if he is lucky." The words settled gently between them while veterans continued working quietly around the clearing beneath the Montana sky. And standing there beside an old Navy veteran, a loyal German shepherd, and a trailer no longer buried beneath silence, Caleb Mercer finally understood exactly what his father had meant. By the second morning, the clearing around Walter's trailer no longer resembled the forgotten patch of wilderness Caleb had first driven into through the snowstorm. Tire tracks crisscrossed the frozen ground beneath pale winter sunlight. Fresh lumber leaned neatly beside the porch. Smoke curled warmly from the repaired furnace vent overhead. rising into the cold Montana air like proof that life had returned to the little home in the woods. The trailer itself looked stronger now. New insulation sealed the windows. The sagging roofline had been reinforced overnight by volunteers who worked beneath floodlights until nearly 3 in the morning. Somebody had even shoveled a clean pathway from the porch to the mailbox at the road. Walter stood outside wrapped in his pea coat and wool gloves while Rex walked slowly beside him through the snow-covered clearing. The old Navy veteran paused near the new mailbox, painted dark navy blue, and gently brushed fresh snow from the top with one gloved hand. For several quiet seconds, he simply stared at it. Caleb approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, while morning light filtered softly through the pines around them. "Still getting used to it?" he asked. Walter accepted the coffee carefully. "Feels strange." Caleb looked around the clearing, where volunteers still moved between vehicles and tool trailers. "Having help?" Walter nodded slowly. "Being seen." The words settled quietly into the cold air between them. Rex sat beside Walter and leaned gently against his leg while distant hammering echoed softly near the porch, where Frank and several veterans continued reinforcing weak sections of flooring. Sheriff Dugan stepped outside the trailer carrying a stack of envelopes bundled tightly beneath one arm. "More mail," he announced. Walter frowned immediately. "Already? Turns out half the country wants to write you letters." The sheriff handed him the stack carefully. Children's drawings slipped between handwritten notes from veterans, military families, widows, and strangers who simply recognized something sacred in an old man trying to trade medals for groceries. Walter looked overwhelmed all over again. "I don't know these people." Sheriff Dugan smiled faintly. "That's kind of the point." Caleb noticed Walter's hands trembling slightly as he opened the first envelope. Inside was a handwritten card from a 12-year-old boy in Texas whose grandfather served in Vietnam. "Thank you for protecting people you never met." Walter stared at the sentence for a long moment before quietly folding the card back into the envelope. Another letter came from a widow in Ohio whose husband had died 2 years earlier after battling loneliness following military service. Another from a young Marine stationed overseas who wrote simply, "We remember you now, sir." Walter pressed one weathered hand against his mouth briefly before looking away toward the mountains. Caleb pretended not to notice the tears gathering in the old veteran's eyes. Men like Walter deserve privacy around grief. Around noon, a convoy of state vehicles finally arrived at the clearing carrying repair crews and Veterans Affairs coordinators. Unlike the frantic energy of social media or reporters, these people moved with deliberate, quiet professionalism. They inspected the trailer carefully, replaced damaged wiring, arranged long-term heating support, scheduled medical evaluations. One woman in a dark winter coat sat beside Walter at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, helping him complete paperwork he had spent years too tired to fight through alone. Rex never left Walter's side during any of it. The shepherd followed him room to room like a shadow stitched from loyalty itself. At one point, Walter sat quietly in the recliner while state officials discussed structural repairs near the kitchen. Rex climbed halfway across the old veteran's feet and rested there heavily, almost protectively. Walter smiled down at him and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know," he murmured softly. "Duke used to do the same thing whenever Eleanor cried." Caleb looked over from the porch doorway. "Maybe he thinks you need guarding too." Walter's smile softened sadly. "Maybe we all do eventually." That afternoon, Frank drove Walter into town for a medical appointment while Caleb stayed behind helping several volunteers finish repairs around the trailer. The grocery store video still spread online faster than anyone expected. News stations requested interviews hourly. National veterans organizations reached out, offering support and housing assistance. Walter refused almost all publicity. "I'm not a mascot," he muttered firmly more than once. Caleb respected that. The old Navy veteran never wanted fame. He only wanted enough heat to survive winter with dignity intact. Late in the afternoon, Caleb found himself alone outside stacking fresh firewood beside the porch while snow melted slowly from the roof overhead beneath weak sunlight. Rex wandered nearby through the clearing, sniffing fresh tracks left by volunteers coming and going all day. The shepherd eventually stopped near the edge of the woods and looked back toward Caleb expectantly. "What is it, boy?" Rex gave a quiet huff and trotted deeper toward the pine trees bordering the property. Caleb followed slowly through crunching snow until Rex stopped beside a weathered wooden cross partially hidden beneath frost and fallen pine needles. Caleb froze slightly when he saw the small, engraved name burned into the wood. Eleanor Hayes. Fresh snow covered the simple, grave marker tucked peacefully beneath the trees overlooking the valley below. Rex sat quietly beside it as wind moved softly through the branches overhead. Caleb stared at the grave for a long moment before hearing footsteps approach behind him. Walter stood there beneath the pines wearing his pea coat and holding a small bundle of white winter flowers someone had delivered earlier that day. "She loved this view," he said softly. Caleb stepped aside while Walter knelt slowly beside the grave with visible effort. Rex remained still nearby, ears lowered gently as though understanding the sacredness of the moment. Walter placed the flowers carefully against the frozen earth and brushed snow from the wooden cross with one trembling glove. "I used to come talk to her every morning," he whispered, "especially after my son passed." Caleb remained silent beneath the pine trees while cold mountain wind stirred softly around them. Walter stared out toward the distant snow-covered valley below. "Some days," he admitted quietly, "the silence inside that trailer felt so heavy I thought I might disappear inside it." Rex slowly moved closer and pressed his warm body against Walter's shoulder. The old veteran rested one hand against the shepherd's fur without looking away from Eleanor's grave. "Then this stubborn dog walks into my life," he murmured softly. Caleb smiled faintly. "He has a habit of doing that." Walter finally looked up toward him, tired blue eyes calmer now than Caleb had ever seen them. "Your father once told me something after a rescue operation overseas." Snow drifted softly from the pine branches above them, while evening light faded gold across the mountains. "He said surviving is not the same thing as living." Walter looked down toward Rex leaning faithfully beside him. "I think somewhere along the way, I forgot the difference." 3 weeks later, winter sunlight poured softly across the Montana Valley beyond Walter Hayes' trailer, turning the snow along the mountains into sheets of pale gold beneath a clear blue sky. The storms had finally passed. Pine branches no longer sagged beneath heavy ice, and the little clearing off County Road 12 looked alive in a way Caleb could hardly recognize from that first freezing night. The trailer stood repaired and steady now. Fresh paint covered the old siding. Strong new steps led to the porch where a handmade wooden sign hung beside the door. "Hayes Cabin." Somebody from town had carved it quietly and nailed it up before sunrise 2 mornings earlier. Walter still pretended not to know who. Smoke drifted warmly from the repaired furnace vent, while wind chimes near the porch roof moved gently in the crisp mountain air. Caleb stood beside his Bronco watching Rex chase drifting snowflakes across the clearing with the strange puppy-like joy German shepherds sometimes revealed only around people they trusted completely. Nearby, Maggie the cat slept lazily in a patch of sunlight near the porch railing as if she personally owned the mountain now. Walter sat in the old rocking chair beside the front door wrapped in a heavy wool blanket with a mug of coffee warming his hands. He looked different. Still 90. Still thin. Still carrying decades in the lines of his face. But something had returned to his eyes. Light perhaps, or maybe simply rest. The kind that only arrived when loneliness finally loosened its grip on a human soul. Caleb walked slowly toward the porch while fresh snow crunched beneath his boots. Walter watched Rex bounding through the clearing and smiled faintly. "That dog has more energy than common sense." Caleb leaned against the porch railing. "He gets that from me." Walter chuckled softly beneath his breath. The sound came easier now. Not forced. Not rare. Just human again. They sat quietly for a while listening to wind move through the pines and distant hammering somewhere down the road, where volunteers still repaired storm damage for older residents nearby. The movement Walter's story created had not ended at his trailer. Veterans groups now checked on elderly former servicemen across the county every week. The customer who filmed the original video publicly apologized for turning Walter's pain into content, and the grocery store manager, ashamed by what had happened under his roof, helped organize food deliveries for isolated veterans during winter storms. Even the utility board changed emergency heating policies after state investigations uncovered dozens of delayed assistance cases. Small things, quiet things, but real. None of it erased the years Walter had spent cold, hungry, and unseen, and Caleb knew better than to pretend one viral night could repair every broken promise. But it did prove something Walter had almost stopped believing. People could still choose one another, even after years of looking away. Walter stared toward the mountains for several moments before speaking softly. "You know what surprises me most?" Caleb looked over. Walter smiled faintly into his coffee. "How many people were hurting quietly just like me?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Most people hide it well." Walter's eyes drifted toward the repaired mailbox near the road where fresh letters still arrived almost daily from strangers around the country. "Maybe we got too good at pretending we don't need each other." Rex suddenly bounded back toward the porch carrying a pine branch nearly twice the size he could reasonably manage. Walter laughed quietly as the shepherd dropped it proudly at his feet. "Good Lord. He thinks he is a lumberjack." Now, Caleb crouched beside Rex and scratched behind his ears. "He likes it here." Walter looked toward the dog gently. "So do I." The words carried more meaning than they first appeared to. Caleb understood that now. Walter no longer spoke about surviving winter, or overdue bills, or disappearing quietly into the woods. The old Navy veteran spoke about spring gardens Eleanor used to plant beside the porch, about repainting the kitchen cabinets, about teaching Rex how to behave around Maggie without getting swatted across the nose every morning. Small future things, human things, living things. A truck pulled slowly into the clearing just before noon, carrying Frank Delaney and Sheriff Dugan. Both men climbed out bundled in heavy winter jackets, carrying paper bags that smelled strongly of fresh barbecue from town. "We brought lunch," Frank announced loudly before glancing toward Walter. "And before you complain, no, you're not allowed to refuse free brisket." Walter shook his head with mock disappointment. "You people are becoming impossible." Sheriff Dugan grinned beneath his gray beard. "That's because we finally figured out where you live." Soon the porch filled with warm food, coffee, quiet laughter, and the easy rhythm of men who no longer needed to explain themselves to one another. Rex stretched across the porch boards near Walter's boots while Maggie glared at him from the windowsill with ancient feline judgment. Sunlight warmed the clearing softly as wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the clean scent of snow and cedar. At one point, Frank handed Walter a small wooden box wrapped carefully in cloth. Walter frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Open it." Walter lifted the lid slowly. Inside rested his medals. Polished now, carefully mounted against dark blue velvet beside a brass plaque engraved with simple words. "Honor does not expire." Walter stared silently at the display while nobody on the porch spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter for a moment. His fingers trembled gently against the edge of the box. "Frank." The old seal cleared his throat roughly and looked away toward the mountains. "About time somebody displayed them properly." Walter swallowed hard and lowered his eyes. Caleb noticed tears gathering there again, though the old veteran smiled this time instead of hiding them. "Eleanor would have liked this," he whispered softly. Rex slowly lifted his head and rested it against Walter's knee as if sensing the emotion rising inside him. Walter immediately buried one weathered hand into the shepherd's fur. Then, after a long silence, he looked out across the snowy valley stretching endlessly beyond the clearing. "You know," he said quietly, "for a while there, I thought the world had moved on without men like us." Caleb sat beside him beneath the warm winter sunlight. "Maybe it did for a little while." Walter nodded faintly, but somehow grace found its way back. Nobody answered because nobody needed to. The truth already lived there in the repaired trailer, in the veterans who kept visiting every weekend, in the letters stacked beside Eleanor's photograph, in the warmth finally filling rooms once frozen by silence. And most of all, it lived in the old German shepherd lying faithfully beside a 90-year-old veteran who no longer faced winter alone. The afternoon sun slowly dipped lower across the mountains while Rex slept peacefully at Walter Hayes's feet, and the little cabin in the woods glowed warm against the snow like a quiet miracle nobody planned, but everybody needed.